Hi, and welcome to the Bossed Up Podcast, episode 494. I'm your host, Emily Aries, the founder and CEO of Bossed Up. And today I am so excited to share a conversation I just had all about matrescence, which, if you haven't heard this term before, this is the transformative experience of becoming a mother. You know, we talk a lot about adolescence as a similar metamorphosis, but we don't really acknowledge the identity change, the physiological change, the social change, the absolute earth-shattering changes that go on when you first become a mom. And luckily, a lot of new research, a lot of new conversations and literature have popped up around matrescence in recent years, including a phenomenal new book written by today's guest, Lucy Jones, called Matrescence on Pregnancy, Childbirth, and Motherhood. And I'm so excited to introduce you to Lucy, who brings a really interesting scientific background to today's topic. She's an award-winning journalist and author of 4 books, including the best-selling Losing Eden: Why Our Minds Need the Wild, a Times and Telegraph Book of the Year, and most recently, the Women's Prize long-listed Matrescence on the Metamorphosis of Pregnancy, Childbirth, and Motherhood, a New Statesman Book of the Year. Her first book, Foxes Unearthed, won the Society of Authors Roger Deakin Award and was longlisted for the Wainwright Prize. Her writing on ecology, health, and science has been published by BBC Earth, the Sunday Times, GQ, and the New Statesman, among others. Lucy is based in Hampshire in the UK and brings a perspective of now a 3-time mother herself with 3 kiddos. And she chronicles her experiences of matrescence in her book in a way that's part memoir, part scientific inquiry, and part unearthing of the evidence-based research that has come about in recent years, as well as some of the writing from back in the 1970s and prior about the institution of motherhood and how it still feels, quite frankly, oppressive to so many women, even today, and in some ways more than ever. I really enjoyed recording this conversation with Lucy on the cusp of the arrival of my second child back in early September. I know you're not hearing this for quite a while after then, but this was the last podcast interview I recorded before going on my maternity leave. So I hope you enjoy today's truly eye-opening conversation with Lucy Jones. So without further ado, Lucy, welcome to the Bossed Up Podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm very excited to have this conversation, not only because you've written a phenomenal book about this topic, matrescence, but because I'm almost 37 weeks pregnant as we speak, on the brink of welcoming my second child into the world. And it just feels like a very timely time to have this conversation.
Congratulations. And it's lovely to talk to you at this, threshold moment.
Thank you. One of the things I admitted to you before we hit record is that I was just had a conversation with my nurse midwife last week and said to her at my appointment, I feel so much better going into pregnancy and childbirth round 2 because, matrescence is not on the table like it is with your first child. And she looked at me like, matrescence, huh? I need to, what a $10 word. I should probably know more about that. I thought, yes, you should. So why don't we start there? What is matrescence, and how did a science writer like you come to find yourself writing a whole book about this topic?
Sure. Thank you. So matrescence means simply the process of becoming a mother. So the word is a bit like adolescence or senescence, and you can hear that kind of metamorphosis within the word. It was coined by the late American anthropologist Dana Raphael in the 1970s. So she wrote an essay where she introduced this concept and idea, which she had seen in many cultures and societies across the world. This sense that when a baby is born, a mother is too, and the mother and the woman or birthing person is experiencing a significant transition, a significant existential, physical, psychological, emotional, social change. And back then when she when she was writing about this concept, she compared what she saw in most cultures to society in the US and global north, where we don't have a sense of a newborn mother in the same way, and rituals and rites. And I discovered that word in an article in the New York Times by the reproductive psychiatrist Alexandra Sachs. And my first child was 9 months old. I had gone into motherhood, a much wanted child, and my baby was spectacular, as all babies are. But I had no idea that anything would kind of happen to me, apart from I was a gestational mother. I carried our child. But my sense was that my body was kind of like a box or a pot, and that she would grow inside me, and then she would be born, and then I would feed for a bit, but basically me and my husband would be equal, and I'd go back to work as normal, and I'd earn as normal, and I'd be the same person. And that was so far from the truth and the reality for me that it was a really big shock. And I found it in many ways quite difficult. But when I read this word 9 months in, thinking, going through thoughts like there must be something really wrong with me. This is meant to be the happiest time of my life. I had quite kind of naive, limited, basic ideas of motherhood. I had kind of bought into the maternal ideal, this kind of imperative that you must enjoy every minute. And, that's what I was being told, etc. But reading that word matrescence and learning that this was a significant developmental stage for me and for all the women around me was utterly transformative. And my shoulders dropped, I breathed. I was like, okay, well, this is why I feel so weird. And, maybe that's okay. I mean, there's lots of reasons why the institution of motherhood is not okay in our societies, but it was a relief to find out, okay, something's happening. And that set me on the journey of researching, what happens to the brain, what happens to the body, what happens to the mind, what happens to you socially, etc.
Yeah. There was a passage you almost referenced just now that really stood out to me. Even during pregnancy, you write, I thought the baby would grow inside my body as in a flower pot, that I would still be the same person, but that didn't seem to be the case. And that just struck me because the way we talk about adolescence is not you're going to be the same person at the end of this transition. It's this is weird, uncomfortable at times, kind of smelly, possibly, right? Definitely uncomfortable, socially awkward, and it's radical change. But we don't talk about matrescence or have the language that's been socially normalized to see becoming a mother as having all those natural similarities of metamorphosis, right?
Absolutely that. And we don't have that understanding yet, or maybe we're starting to get that understanding. We're starting to get a lot more understanding about, menopause. And like you say, we all expect adolescents to feel kind of weird and to need support or to need some kind of nurture. But if you look at matrescence in our society and what happens to mothers when they become women, when they become mothers, there is a significant health element. There's lots of things that can happen mentally, physically, and so on. And so I think actually we've neglected this stage and this transition, and that the concept of matrescence kind of illuminates it and allows us to kind of care about each other a bit more and a bit better, to be able to say, like, how's your matrescence, or how was your matrescence, or what can I do to support you in your matrescence? Same goes for putrescence as well. I mean, fathers too, of course.
Interesting. And I would love to see more attention there as well. It feels like the next frontier. Why do you think we center the baby, right? In this process, as opposed to centering the mother in this process? The arrival of your first child is massive and it's wonderful and it's spectacular and it's makes sense that we nurture the baby, but the nurturing of the mother seems to run contrary to what you've alluded to, the institution of motherhood. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure, it's such a great question. I gave birth to my first child in what's called in the UK a baby-friendly hospital.
We have those. Yeah.
Yeah, and I remember feeling after birth, which was for me quite a long birth, it was quite chaotic and violent and painful as many births are. And I felt quite kind of abandoned in a way. And I remember thinking at that point, baby friendly, like where's the mother in that? I understand that obviously babies are of the most vulnerable of all humans and they need all of our care and support. But there is, as Donald Winnicott, the psychoanalyst, said, there's no baby without a mother. There's no baby without a birthing person. And what I noticed in my becoming a mother 8 years ago or so was a pattern of absence around maternal health, proper advice, scientifically evidenced advice, thorough, comprehensive information about what the body needs after birth, about what the body goes through in pregnancy, about risks that can happen in birth, or, simply kind of really simple stuff like, you bleed quite a bit after birth, and books don't really tell you how long that might be or what you might need for that and so on. I remember getting like one box of pads or something, thinking, it would be like a period, but I had to order like a box every day for like 4 or 5 weeks or something. That's just what the body goes through. But I think that with that absence of information and kind of care and concern for the new mother, what I've seen since publishing this book is that often women will kind of turn it as a sense of shame. If things are feeling big and it's feeling wild to become a mother, but no one's kind of thinking about the mother, so then they think there's something wrong with them and they kind of turn in on themselves. So that's why I think this idea, this concept, which has been popularized by lots of people before me, is so powerful, because it just gives us the word and the language to say, actually, matrescence is a vulnerable time. It is the most dangerous time actually in a woman's life course for mental health risks. Comes with risks to, for depression, different types of mental illness, etc. And we really need to get better at caring for new mothers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you had your own diagnosis of postpartum depression with your first. And by the way, so did I. Similar reasoning, I think, based on what I've seen around feeding challenges and breastfeeding, right? I had a hungry baby for 6 months in my first go round, and that gave me postpartum anxiety and postpartum depression like nothing else will if no one's sleeping for months on end, right? And what really struck me about your experiences and how you write about this is that the Of Woman Born reference that you make from 1976 talks about the institution of motherhood, making it feel like mothers are just a natural, instinctual, born with it characteristic, as opposed to a set of caregiving skills that can and frankly must be learned and sometimes are hard earned, right? And it makes you feel like if you're struggling in early motherhood, not only to care for yourself, but to care for your new, very vulnerable infant, like you're not a natural born mother. And somehow that's a personal failing, right? And so that experience, to have the name Matrescence, or the sort of description of Matrescence as this adolescent type period of learning how to be a new kind of person, I think is such a reframe, as opposed to this institution of motherhood that makes it feel like if you're not naturally inclined towards it, you can't cut it.
That's such a good point. You put that so well, the idea that actually it's a period of learning, and there's no definition of how long matrescence lasts for. Like, I would actually say that mine, I think, has lasted for about 7 years in terms of kind of, learning, settling, grounding, becoming kind of as much as I could be a kind of complete new person.
Yeah, which is part of it, right? It's like you will not be the same person after this.
Yeah, and who knew? I mean,
Who knew that?
Yeah.
I know.
I think that let me just say firstly, I'm sorry that you had a tough time, and what you said about sleep really resonates. I think, we expect new mothers to basically not sleep at all for many months, and that we just don't connect that with the maternal mental health crisis, as if we're machines. But I think the Adrienne Rich's amazing gift to us of this, she distinguished between the institution of motherhood and the experience of motherhood. And I found that super helpful, because by saying the institution of motherhood, she was talking about the kind of systems and structures of society around motherhood. So, it's a political experience becoming a mother, even though we pretend to ourselves it's private, political decision about childcare, political decision about, paid leave, all these things are political. But I found it very helpful, this idea of being able to kind of separate the institution from the experience in a way that allowed me to critique and analyze the situation. Because, for a long time, I thought if I say anything negative about being a mom, people are just going to think I don't love my kid. And, and that's still, I think, quite an oppressive pressure, of the patriarchal motherhood vibe that people, which is kind of suppressing potential, power and revolution and change, and that gives us a way of saying the institution, thinking about, I've seen in so much of your brilliant work, the mixture of individual and collective. Obviously Matrescence, I will end on this, I'm rambling, but Matrescence is a very individual experience, of course, so women of colour, women of socioeconomic disadvantage, neurodiverse women, queer women, lots, people will have different vulnerabilities, risks, social factors that will make it more of a vulnerable situation. But it's also a very collective, social, ecological experience.
Totally. And you're not rambling at all, for what it's worth, because that is the water we swim in here. And honestly, so we're recording this in September, early September. It's not coming out until mid-February, but I've been struck here in the States at how much our presidential election, is centering on mothers and parents right now. Who saw that coming? It's like, whether we're talking about single, childless cat ladies, J.D. Vance's infamous quote, or we're talking about the cost of childcare exponentially rising in this country, reproductive freedoms being stripped away from women in the past decade here, not even 4 years here. So it's really kind of shocking to me how much motherhood is taking center stage in this presidential election. I have no idea how it's going to turn out by the time this episode airs, but knocking on all the wood that it turns out.
Me too. That's such a good point. I think it's interesting also to see this kind of widespread panic about birth rate and, the kind of demonization of childless, cat ladies, whatever. And it's well, a declining birth rate is partly there because, neoliberal individualistic societies such as yours and mine have created a very hostile society in which to raise children. And it's not we are social beings. We need people. I hope that this kind of myth and idea that, women can just, have the babies and be at home and it's natural, and basically, prop up the economy by producing the workers without complaint is coming to an end, because, we're people too, and we need to be in positions of power as well.
You wrote so brilliantly here early on in your book, I would soon learn that caregiving was much, much harder, more confronting, exciting, creative, beautiful, stressful, alarming, rewarding, tedious, transformative, enlivening, and occasionally deadening than I imagined, and much more essential to a working society than we give it credit for. And I think that sums it up, right? It's both this bamboozling that you kind of described, that we've been sold this natural, beautiful, calm, warm and fuzzy image of what motherhood looks like. And in fact, it's a really challenging and beautiful, but absolutely fundamental part of how we prop up society. And we're expected to do so with little support, right? From that society that relies on mothers.
Absolutely. And I think, it's so connected with this idea of the scare quote kind of natural mother, the naturalization of the mother and, this idea that it's like, this old idea that it's kind of like women's ultimate fulfillment and purpose is a way of, not providing proper social support and social care and make trying to make it as private as possible, which doesn't help, doesn't help anyone.
No, absolutely. If it's a personal problem, then you have to figure it out on your own, right? In that sort of neoliberal individualist way. So somewhere in between. It's somewhere in between, isn't it? Because everyone's experience is different, but that doesn't mean it should be private, ignored by public policy, right?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like new mothers today are kind of being asked to do something quite impossible, which is to, work like we don't have kids and raise kids like we don't work. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think there's a kind of Andrea O'Reilly, the amazing feminist academic, kind of said something along the lines of, at the time women were winning, their rights in the workplace, suddenly these maternal ideals come in, which are very oppressive, this kind of, intensive motherhood idea. And I think that the more we can talk about it, the more we can share about it, the more we can kind of bust some of the myths and some of the taboos, and the easier it is to kind of realize that people are feeling the same way, and to organize and to support each other, and, to fight, because there is so much grotesque like inequality around matrescence. Like, if you like matrescence, I think is a really good like avenue to look at how society's going wrong. So for example, in the UK, Black women are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth in the perinatal period, and I think it's similar in the US. And that's just, I mean, there's no words for that. It's like such a shame on our society, a stain on our society, that that's the case. So, I think there is a lot of social power in thinking about this transition and looking at it and kind of bringing it out from under the carpet or out of the nursery.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of how we do that is sort of like bridging the world of science and public policy, right? Because we've been talking quite a bit about how we need systemic acknowledgement of this period. But you also get into the science of just how significant a transformation this is. And I think I related to feeling in my brain like things were changing. Even at times within the first year of my son's life, I did feel like a rebellious teenager who was like grasping at something that made me feel like my individual self again, like kind of acting out and like not regulating very well. My poor husband can tell you more about that. But it's like, I just remember feeling really unhinged in a way. And you kind of get into the fact that our brains are going through massive change during this time in ways that I recall learning about adolescence, but not Matrescene. So what did you uncover in that scientific inquiry?
Yeah, so this really blew my mind. And yeah, similar to you, I felt quite unhinged, and I did some quite unhinged things.
Yeah.
And felt just very like my brain was a different brain to what it had been before. I was very preoccupied by the baby, hypervigilant, highly anxious, but also it just felt different and I couldn't really explain it. And no one had ever said your brain's going to change. Like, no one had said anything like, you give birth, but actually there are changes that remain. And I was so fortunate that the year my first child was born, 2016, was the year when this landmark, groundbreaking study was published by Elseline Hoeksma and her team of neuroscientists. And for the first time, they found that pregnancy renders significant and pronounced changes in the human brain. And lots of scientists have built on that work since, finding like incredible things like the changes in pregnancy and early motherhood to the brain are as seismic and dramatic as those in adolescence. And like we said before, like everyone knows what it feels like to be an adolescent. It's such a weird, long period of adjustment. But that's what's happening to women and birthing people who are becoming mothers. I mean, it's bananas how big it is and how small it is presented as. So we also know, in terms of the brain science, I just give you a little whistle-stop tour. Obviously, there's more about it in my book. So presumably the brain is changing in order for the mother to care for the infant. And there's also, I found this so interesting, there are areas of the brain, of all sorts of areas of the brain that change, including the default mode network. And one researcher put it as these changes alter the neural basis of the self. And I think that really speaks to this kind of like sense that your self has changed, your identity. You know, a lot of women talk to me, and I resonate with this kind of sense of disintegration or of dissolving, like, who am I? Like, do I even exist? Like, what am I, kind of thing. And the other really interesting aspect of this work is that it isn't just pregnant women whose brains change. We know that the father brain changes and non-birthing mothers. So with hands-on affectionate care of the baby is eliciting changes in the brain. You know, we're all born with the neural circuitry to give care. We evolved in collective caregiving networks. You know, it makes sense that we can all give care. It's not just a thing that, you know, women and mothers can do, obviously. And now we know that fathers' brains anatomically change as well. I'll end on this. This does mean, though, that with this kind of unparalleled plasticity of the brain, there is, as we know about in adolescence, a vulnerability. So when the brain is changing so much and it's really plastic, it can be vulnerable to severe stress. So social factors such as poverty, systemic racism, domestic violence, or a child with a significant health problem, birth trauma, there's lots of different factors which can make this a much more precarious time. So I think the brain science is fascinating. I'm sure they're adding to it all the time. But essentially it underlines, I think, and illuminates or kind of cements this notion that, you know, we're talking about, that so many mothers know, that it is a big change and that your brain is literally changing shape. And that's going to maybe take a little while to kind of get used to.
Right. And it's runs contrary to, I think, how the modern feminist movement has made us believe like we can do it all in the same way that men do it, right? And I'm so glad that you're acknowledging how men and fathers have their own matrescence journey and their own brain changes, because it's really not all on moms, but we're also going through something that is not akin to just, you know, having a flower grow out of a flower pot, right? It's so much more significant that it, you know, it makes sense if you are not yourself after this experience.
Absolutely. And I think you bring in such an important point. And, you know, thank goodness for the feminists over decades and centuries for, you know, winning us various rights. But I think in the kind of late 20th century, there was a sense of kind of motherhood being seen as what was holding women back. And so needing to kind of push it under the carpet, pretend it doesn't really happen.
Delay it.
Yeah, delay it, be like men in order to survive in the kind of economy that we live in. And now I think we maybe feel, you know, safe enough. And I say that, you know, I'm conscious of my own privilege, you know, as a white woman and a middle class woman in the UK, to say, actually, becoming a mother is also like a big, meaningful, seismic thing. Like, I'm sure we can have both things. Like, we can have the work that we women need to do, and society needs women to do, as well as, you know, caring for this at this vulnerable time and supporting new mothers.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad to see that becoming the sort of next frontier for feminists, both on a personal and public policy standpoint. You can also kind of see it fracturing us as women online with the rise of the trad wife hashtag. And, you know, it feels like another mommy wars is upon us, when I'm like, I totally believe there's such a wide spectrum of experiences for women who are child-free by choice, right? All the way to women who opt out of the paid workforce to become moms. Like, we need a feminist movement that welcomes and acknowledges all of that diversity, right?
Absolutely. And choice, giving everyone a choice, including men and fathers, you know, giving a lot, like, you know, opening it up properly so that men actually can take part in the challenges and toils and rewards of caregiving.
Yeah, absolutely. And that without losing their job and career along the way, if they want it, you know? Wow, we could talk for hours about this. And there's so much more to your book, Matrescence, on pregnancy, childbirth, and motherhood, which was just released here in the States back in May. Congratulations again on this triumph. What would you want to leave listeners knowing about what you hope to accomplish with this book? What do you hope women, caregivers, parents of all kinds who read this walk away with knowing?
I think that since publishing this book, I've been really struck by, and I've been written to by many hundreds of women now, been really struck by a sense of women feeling like they have to do it alone, or that they're alone in their kind of what they see as a failing, like in some way, that they're failing to be this kind of perfect natural mother and work and et cetera, et cetera. And then there's shame and there's stigma, and that creates barriers and obstacles. So I suppose with this book, it's so gratifying to me to feel like I'm connecting with women and then allowing women to talk to other women and men and everybody, because I think while a revolution might take a while, shame and stigma can be eroded quite easily with a conversation or with a how's your matrescence, or how can I care for you, or something like that. So I guess it's an aim of connecting people and making people not feel alone or alienated.
Amazing. Well, I think we have accomplished part of that mission, hopefully today. And Lucy, I want to just thank you so much for this triumphant work, but also just like bringing your full self to this conversation. And it is such an overdue topic that I've been meaning to tackle here on the podcast. And I'm so excited to have had this opportunity to connect with you. Where can my listeners learn more about you and keep up with all the great work you're doing?
I'm kind of sporadically on Instagram at Lucy F. Jones. I have a website. I don't really do X, but Instagram really. And yeah, let me just say that thank you so much for having me. And, I'm such an admirer of your work and what you have created and the work that you do. And I'm also wishing you so well for your new arrival and your second matrescence.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that selfishly. Let me squeeze in one last question here, actually. You're a mom of 3, right? And you've been a mom for a while now. What should I expect for round 2? How was matrescence for you round 2?
So I think that there's nothing like the first matrescence. So that is like the most intense, bigger shock. But I think that I have had kind of a different matrescence with each one. It's different going from 1 to 2. And also it kind of depends on the child. Every child is different. Their temperament might bring up, we haven't even talked about what it could bring up in you. Like having children could bring up all the stuff from the past, etc. I think it's such a complex and wild thing to bring a new person into the world. But I would say, there's nothing like the first that, you got this.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. That's sort of my interpretation, having seen many of my peers go through round 2 at this point and been like, there's a debate. Is it harder to go from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2? And I can understand both sides of that, but the absolute shell shock of your entire identity shifting is just not something I was prepared for round 1 and feel much more prepared for this time around. So I'm glad to hear that. Well, thank you so much for indulging me, Lucy. It's been such a pleasure.
It was lovely to speak to you. Thank you for having me, Emily.
For more links to everything that Lucy and I just talked about, head to bossedup.org/episode 494. That's bossedup.org/episode 494. And now I want to hear from you. What did you make of today's conversation? Have you experienced your own matrescence? If so, what resonated with you? Or what was different for you than what we described here today? If you're a mom-to-be or someone who's thinking about becoming a parent someday, what did you make of this conversation? I would love to, as always, keep the conversation going in the Bossed Up Courage community on Facebook and in the Bossed Up LinkedIn group. And until next time, let's keep bossin' in pursuit of our purpose, and together, let's lift as we climb.